Alright, hey y'all. Now we'll jump back into Sara Ahmed's Differences That Matter here, looking at the second chapter. So now we're moving into this question, the question of ethics in relation to not only postmodernism but feminism as well. So for her, she starts out the chapter by asking what is at stake in the production of a postmodern ethics. This is a difficult question that demands a cautious analysis. Postmodern ethics does not exist prior to its articulation in specific texts. So it only comes to being in some way as it is made manifest in a sort of textuality, or when it finds itself in the form of text. So in this way, there is the implication of, or it really lays claim to, the post aspect of its title, i.e. it coming after that thing called modernism or modernity. So for Ahmed, postmodernism is here the temporary forgetting of the ethical demand, insofar as its name itself ambiguously as a posting of modernity, or that coming after. So it is the suggestion, or at least what postmodernism itself suggests about itself, is that there is, or there was something lost in modernity, notably the variation of perspectives that can be ultimately reclaimed in the postmodern movement, especially through the analysis of a certain textuality that at least it claims to allow for a certain democratic type approach to come to fruition, or a more egalitarian one, whatever that would look like. So like we discussed in the last video here, Ahmed is very cautious about this narrative around postmodernism leading to some kind of benevolent opening up of a certain possibility, because for her, she always wants us to consider the extent to which our discourse around any such benevolence is itself only another tool operated or mobilized by a certain hierarchical system. So about this chapter, she says to the introduction in her chapter here, she states that she wants to avoid making any general pronouncements on how postmodernism deals with the ethical, which presupposes that the essential debate is between universality versus difference and sameness versus otherness. So it's this kind of reductive thinking, and one that postmodernism kind of plays into, at least for her, is the maintenance of these kind of binaries. So the before and the after, the repressed and the emancipated, the universal and the, I guess, individual in some way, that, and how these constructions of these binaries are in themselves part and parcel of a greater system of domination. So she jumps into the first section in this chapter by evoking the work of Lyotard, specifically the critique that Chris Norris employs against Lyotard. Now, Chris Norris is a pretty outspoken thinker against, and he's still alive, I think he's still around, against postmodernism, essentially a thinker who suggested that postmodernism failed to account for the extent to which reactionary politics, or generally conservative politics, was not properly addressed by postmodernism, and how we must think of a more radical approach, or something that deals primarily with, the material existence, material conditions of life, and not to burden ourselves by getting lost in the obscurity of whatever postmodernism is for him. So Ahmed evokes Chris Norris's critique of Lyotard by essentially where he argues, and this is her quoting him, Norris argues in very strong terms that postmodernism is simply a symptom of the present malaise. And then she goes on to say that he suggests that postmodernism in general, and Lyotard's work in particular, fails to provide any critical challenge to the rise of new forms of conservative thinking, precisely insofar as it assumes that the concepts of critique and judgment are residual signs of an outdated modernity. Now we could really go into Chris Norris here. I hope I didn't say Chuck before. Chris Norris here, because he has a pretty big critique of Baudrillard, which I'm much more familiar with, and it's, to me, his critiques are just, they're important to some extent, but one of the most annoying things is that there seems to be a refusal to engage with the texts in their own terms, where he just says, I'm coming from this background, where we see a certain pragmatics to politics or theory that must be realized, and anything that falls outside of that is simply part and parcel of a system of general apathy or an acquiescence with a system that works in their favor. So it's not exactly the best critique of postmodernism. I find what Sara Ahmed does here is much better, even though at any point when you're dealing with a critique of postmodernism, it's difficult to reconcile because postmodernism is a term that was really not taken up by any of these thinkers, except Lyotard perhaps, but Baudrillard, Deleuze, Foucault, none of these thinkers were or avidly claimed that title. In fact, many of them tried to distance themselves from it. So it's a difficult thing to take up, and Chris Norris doesn't do it particularly effectively. So if there are any big Chris Norris fans out there, I hope I didn't offend you. So Ahmed continues to get back on track here by thinking about, or by considering Lyotard's critique of universal judgment, i.e. in his the postmodern condition, thinking about the opening up of this new sphere that allows for a plethora of voices supposedly to come in. So that sort of critique against universal judgment is in itself simply a participating in the construction of certain binaries between inside and outside. So for Ahmed, we need to ask, how does the construction of postmodernism in Lyotard's work organize itself through a critique of universalism and ethics, and what particular form and effects does this critique have? So this is in thinking about Lyotard's critique of meta-narratives, or the grand, explanations for general cultural societal malaise, whether it be class or sex, or gender, anything like that. Lyotard was one of those thinkers that wanted to think about the plethora of possibilities that could supplant these meta-narratives. So another text and another example that Ahmed draws upon is Lyotard's The Differend, which is a really difficult text and is something I don't understand totally, so I apologize. I'm just going to take Ahmed's work on this. It's a text I've tried to get into, but it's very difficult. So in The Differend, Ahmed says of that Lyotard discusses the Kashinahua narratives as examples of small and self-legitimating narratives, which cannot be reconciled into the universal story of man. He argues that a wrong occurs when the Kashinahua are judged in relation to that story, that meta-narrative, a judgment which violates their incommensurability or their otherness. Now, this is something that Baudrillard does as well, and for those people that have followed this or seen some of my previous episodes, dealing with The Mirror of Production, Baudrillard's fourth book, there is a lot of that going on, where there's the location in primitive peoples, so one of the terms he uses, a sort of otherness that stands radically opposed to the grand narratives of the West, which at first glance may appear, at least for us or even for Ahmed, to be something of a good move, like to consider the way in which these people stand radically opposed to this system, and how there are other ways of conducting or organizing society. For Ahmed, it's not so simple as that. In fact, that demands a sort of romanticization, a reliance on the construction of these people, as despite their being constructed as heterogeneous, that heterogeneity then becomes a sort of homogeneity. In their otherness, they are galvanized, crystallized, and solidified in that sphere. So in opposition to these meta-narratives, or the broad universal consensus of any kind of truth or way to conduct oneself, Lyotard proposes this paralogy. So paralogy for Lyotard, he takes from the scientific notion of it, where, as Ahmed states, science is not determined by anything other than the transforming boundaries of its own production. It is transformed only by the introduction of new and antagonistic claims. So we can see how that would fit in to the discussion around postmodernism being that space for the multitude of perspectives that are antagonistic, that are contradictory, or in the case of the last episode, how Derrida thought about the law as being something that was always butting up against an exteriority to it, which then came to define it, came to classify it in that way. However, for Ahmed, and this is where she becomes suspicious, is that this form of paralogy is in itself, despite its claim towards a continual heterogeneity, it does in itself demand a sort of reconciliation, or for it to be, I guess, reified under the auspices of a certain, totalizing discourse, even if it is a discourse of movement. So for Ahmed, Lyotard requires some notion of consensus for his own ethics to be feasible, a consensus over the effect that he desires, the production and maintenance of paralogy. His setting up of paralogy against the consensus cannot pragmatically or practically work, as players need to consent to paralogy for it to be possible. So it is in this way that this opening up of this possibility is in itself, or does demand something, ironically, something of a construction or consolidation of that very perspective. So it's on this note that she turns from Lyotard to think about a feminist critique of universalism and what that would necessarily look like, and how it wouldn't necessarily adopt the same discursive approaches employed by Lyotard, at least how he represents postmodernism in this instance. So what she does, or what she wants to do, is demonstrate how the question of gender and ethics does not produce a feminist ethics, but in contrast destabilizes feminism and questions the possibility of any ethical inclusiveness. And this one reason for this, and she states that the category of feminist ethics is often conflated with the category of female or feminine ethics, it in itself, this discussion around feminist ethics, can supplant an already oppressive scheme, an even more, or perhaps not even more, but an equally oppressive one. Because it, again, like we saw in the last chapter with rights or with the law, it homogenizes and essentializes this thing called woman, precisely because of the implicit association between feminism and women for some reason, but that being there does in itself raise some questions about a feminist ethics for whom. So for Ahmed, a feminist critique of universalism may begin with a critique of the subject of universal ethical theory. Such a subject, or the ideal observer, in quotes, is masculine, rational, and disembodied. So we can see this at least in the way that she demonstrated the association between feminist ethics and femininity, or women. There is in those instances a sort of specificity to the feminist ethics, where a feminist ethics is seen as being a subgroup, something of something being derivative from ethics in themselves. So Ahmed wants us to question, what do those ethics, the ones that precede the originary form, what does that look like? Well, for her, that it is ultimately, white, male, perfectly classed in a certain way. And this is something we can think of, thinking back to one of the first examples of ethics, at least rather vulgarly, back to Aristotle for this one in the Nicomachean Ethics, which is really not the same as like moral philosophy, but dealing with the question of happiness or virtue, where happiness can only come about, or being great or anything of that sort, can only come about when someone has attained virtue. We must demand who these are reserved for. Now, the Greeks weren't exactly up to the times with their treatment of slaves, or with the owning of slaves, or their being slaves. So it's very clear that from the onset, from the beginning of this construction of ethics, it did have some association with well-to-do white dudes, quite simply. And that whole discussion that goes into Aristotle totally ignores the conditions of life that most people have to live with, that do not allow them to attain this sort of virtue, this kind of happiness that he speaks about in that text. So in this way, this ethics, the originary one that precedes a feminist ethics, demands a sort of disembodiment, where it's supposed to float above all political issues, and it is not affected, nor does it affect those issues, supposedly. And in contrast to this, what she quotes Lynn Arnault, who argues that such abstractions are impossible, as people's social identity or location necessarily affects their understanding of the world, and hence any evaluative procedure. So it is epistemic in that way, or there are variations with regards to how it can necessarily manifest itself or what it can look like. So in that way, we see a destabilization of this abstracted or universal observer that stands above, transcends the conditions of life that hold other people back, notably visible minorities in almost every form. So in a kind of playful twist, Ahmed proposes that the construction of this femininity in opposition to masculinity, where the feminine is that which has connections to the real conditions of life, has connections to other people, while the masculine is that which stands above it, she suggests that the deployment of this masculine ideal may exclude from ethical consideration the very value of femininity with its constitutive basis in a notion of effective connection with others. In this sense, a feminist critique of a universalist ethical paradigm may actually align itself with the values associated with the feminine, not as that which women simply are, but as that which is made invisible by the universalist criteria implicit to the ideal observer. So this might seem a little bit odd, because there has been, at least at the time writing this text, a distancing between what was considered feminine and this thing called biologically woman. So how do these things, how does Ahmed reconcile these two? Why does she put them together? Because it would seem as though one of feminism's projects was to distance that. Well, for her, this doesn't have anything to do with essentialism, but it's the way in which women have been constructed historically. And it would be naive to assume that you can simply remove yourself from that, because it is continually going on. So in that way, there seems to be, at least for her, a suppression of those things associated with the feminine, right? Which is why, being relegated to the realm of the feminine, they are considered lesser than, derivative, sub-man, or women in that way. So a feminist ethics for Ahmed may help here to expose how ethics involves fluid and contingent relationships between subjects and bodies. So to put it rather simply and rather bluntly, just understanding the conditions of any given situation, the bodies present in those conditions, and how they affect one another in some way. So it's phenomenological in that sense, and phenomenology is something that Ahmed deals with throughout the course of her some of her other books, like Queer Phenomenology, for instance. But how there is a sort of giving and taking between the material conditions of existence, whether they manifest themselves quite literally in the physical objects. And in Queer Phenomenology, she gives the example of a writing table, for instance, but also the way in which power relations operate on certain people, and how those people come to shape power relations, and how it goes back and forth in some form or other. So simply by considering this, which has a grounding in a contextualization that postmodern thinking, at least how she envisions it, would be reluctant to adopt, because that would see a grounding in materiality, which is totally out of this world for postmodernism. How that opens up a certain potential here, a possibility for Ahmed. So what this comes down to, at least in the form of an example, is Ahmed's consideration of the sati, or the women's self-immolation, or the widow self-immolation if the husband dies. So she presents two different approaches, where one by Asseter, at Alison Asseter's Enlightened Women, where she argues that there is a universal basis to ethical decisions. And then Ahmed also presents Gayatri Spivak's understanding of, colonialism. She's a pretty big figure in that realm. So on this problem, Ahmed states that Asseter argues that against Spivak, is that it is uncertain whether the liberal colonial disavowing of sati, widow self-immolation, was emancipatory for women. In other words, Asseter argues that the disallowing of sati was emancipatory for women, as a value is more emancipatory than another, if it has the effect of removing a person or group of people from subjugation. So this presented many problems for Ahmed and Spivak, because that Ahmed wants us to question, okay, from where does this emancipation derive? Is it about emancipating women from patriarchal authority, or is it about white women emancipating women of color, in this case Indian women, from the oppression of Indian men? So in her words, the work of Spivak, amongst others, would complicate this account precisely by reading the colonial decision as the liberation of Indian women from Indian men by white men. In other words, the debate around sati can be seen as the conflict over who had the right to speak for Indian women. So it wasn't about, in this context, listening to what Indian women had to say about what it means to be a sati or to engage in that act, but it was rather the placement on these women, or the construction of a certain narrative about these women that painted them in a certain way, conveniently placing them on the fringes of society and then using that to locate them as a space for otherness, that the white saviors can come and in effect affirm or reaffirm their position of superiority or ethical superiority. So what this comes down to is the recognition of the sort of the taking away of a voice. Probably a better word for that. The taking away of a voice from these women, which cannot be simply recuperated, or it cannot be simply reclaimed through the postmodern claim to, just by simply saying, yes, you can speak and we will listen, precisely because there is a certain, in this example, a colonial apparatus that makes it so that these women or these colonized people can't necessarily speak in a certain way, or when they do speak, we have to interrogate the extent to which that speech is not in the service of, or not coming from these people's own experiences, but is to acquiesce, to sort of please the ears on which it falls, most often the white savior ears. Now, as well, to supplement this, she considers Eagleton, or Terry Eagleton's call for feminism to adopt a sort of universal standard with regards to the treatment of women, which is ultimately for Ahmed translates into a validation of or justification of the mobilization of certain Western colonial apparatuses or neo-colonial apparatuses in suppressing different people, different ways of living, essentially suppressing the possibility of variations in epistemological understanding to come about, precisely because if we construct a sort of universalism around how people are to act, we would see the destructuration of any possibility of these people having a voice, because it would be a voice that would be filtered through this colonial experience. Now all this is culminated into, as Ahmed quotes Chandra Mohanty in relation to Western feminism, how Mohanty analyzes how feminist attempts to account for the universality of gender oppression have led to the production of the category of the third world woman within feminist analysis. And then Mohanty discusses the way in which Western feminism has used universal categories to understand gender relations, categories which have actually been derived from their own experimental frameworks. And we see this echoing today, the discussion around how women who practice Islam are oppressed, and wearing the hijab or the burqa is something that should be shunned upon. And we see that happening very much all throughout the United States, but in even self-claimed liberal places like in Quebec, in Canada, where there are bans placed on the use of women using these head garments, which is all, I think, a consequence of this construction of a sort of universalism, even a supposedly benevolent one that sees its roots in a feminism, where it has placed a certain bar or a certain standard on what proper conduct is. So from this point, she wants to think about otherness. So otherness is being that thing that stands opposed to difference, where difference is sort of tolerated, like take Canada, like multicultural Canada, for instance. Difference is something that is appreciated under the guise of multiculturalism, whereas otherness is the recognition of a sort of it's a difference that can't be reconciled with other othernesses, where there are things that just simply can't be adopted or taken up. So to look at this, she calls upon Levinas, whose work I'm not really familiar with. I just know about him through Derrida, but what she says, and this will be all through her words, where she says that the ethical question to the other takes the form of the face-to-face encounter. The face at once gives and conceals the other. It both constitutes the other's proximity, its nearness which resists incorporation into the side-by-side, and yet always withdraws the other into the mystery of the future. So there is an ambiguity associated with it. And then she continues talking specifically about Levinas. So Levinas, who says that for her, the relationship with the other, the intersubjective space, is radically asymmetrical. And here she quotes him. The other is, for example, the weak, the poor, the widow and the orphan, whereas I am the rich and the powerful. It is here, for me, now this is Ahmed again, that the question of the ethical construction of the other within the narrative becomes uncertain. The other is not reducible to these figures. To make such a reduction is to turn the other into a being whose place can be assigned. Now this is ironic because, again, the postmodern move, or at least the one kind of invoked by Levinas, my God, is coming from I feel like a good place, or it's a recognition of how different ways of being are totally acceptable, but it is one that constructs otherness in certain spaces, locating otherness to be those spaces which can then be inscribed upon, which can then be used or mobilized as a sort of outside potentiation for the in-group, or a space that the in-group can gobble up and then use to affirm their own position. So, to accentuate this point, Ahmed calls upon, once again, Derrida. So for her, Derrida argues that Levinas prioritizes ethical difference over sexual difference. And this is to quote, she is now quoting Derrida, "It is not woman or the feminine that he has rendered secondary, derivative, or subordinate, but sexual difference. Once sexual difference is subordinated, it is always the case that the wholly other, who is not yet marked, is already found to be marked by masculinity," or how that otherness essentially is just a zone for which it is inscribed upon. So, in proper median fashion, she says that Derrida, taking aim at Derrida inscribes, instead of, ethical difference, inscribes his own sexual difference in his misreading of Levinas' text. Derrida simply mirrors for Ahmed the same project that Levinas is conducting. So in opposition to both Levinas and Derrida, Ahmed suggests that a feminist ethics or a feminist approach must address the particularity of an other by assuming that a philosophy of otherness is impossible as such. Such a particularity may not simply be figured. So it's about recognizing the extent, at least in how I read this, the extent to which the term the other, or how people are constructed as other, then makes them as such, rather than recognizing the other as being certain people with certain needs or certain ways of navigating through life. We see them as being simply this otherness, being that homogeneous type space that doesn't have an identity beyond its being outside of the inside. So it's on that note that she concludes this chapter quite simply by saying that the postmodern condition or postmodern approaches don't pay enough heed or attention to those material conditions that conduct people. So now I'll move into the third chapter here, woman. So she begins this chapter by stating that, or asking, how is the relationship between postmodernism and woman come to be determined? And that she suggests, moving on, that we should not assume that there is something within postmodernism that renders its alliance with the feminine automatic, In other words, the relation between woman and postmodern is not essential, but is determined in specific sites of inscription. So she turns firstly to Rosie Bradoty's work. Now, Bradoty is a posthuman type thinker, someone I've considered in my own work, someone I disagree with quite a lot. I have a lot of problems with Bradoty, but I won't get into them here. I might do the posthuman book at some point and lay into it. But in this text, Ahmed draws upon patterns of dissonance, a study of women in contemporary philosophy, where Bradoty evokes the idea of becoming a woman, and how the notion of becoming a woman following Deleuze and refuses the law and truth of modernity and a celebration of otherness, of the feminine in this way. So to this, Ahmed states that while the relationship between a critique of identity, thinking, and sexual difference is constructed through the philosophical, I think the relation can be seen as a difficult one. What is required is not so much a general theory of the relation between postmodernism and sexual difference, but a closer and engaged reading of how postmodernism has aligned itself with the feminine through the refiguration of woman. So when we think of becoming woman, what woman is that? And to kind of lay down the foundation for what she does in this chapter is question what that woman looks like. Is it a black inner city woman, or is it a white suburban straight hair woman? So in this chapter she comes to take aim at Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, in which, this is her words, becoming woman is privileged as the becoming through which all other becomings must pass through engagement with these authorizing texts. I will pose the question of how feminism itself can theorize the instability of woman as a signifier without losing sight of the overdetermined relation between woman and women as historically constituted and embodied subjects. So 1,000 Plateaus for Ahmed is a text that she, on the outset here, acknowledges has been both praised and chastised by feminist thinkers for a plethora of reasons. And reading it, I certainly get that impression that it can go either way. Like, there are certainly things that would seem to align itself with feminist ideas, but at the same time there are many things that oppose that. So ultimately on this specific issue, Ahmed says that she broadly supports the engaged readings of Deleuze and Guattari offered by such writers, and that she doesn't just want to dismiss it as, in her words, male theory. To do this, though, she thinks about, or to critique it, she wants to think about not becoming woman as being one term in itself, but she breaks it down, thinking firstly about the idea of becoming itself. So as she posits, or as she states from 1,000 Plateaus, or what she takes the general thesis about becoming to mean, is that it is a movement between entities, a passing from one to another that is beyond the meeting of 2 points. Becomings are not imitations, identifications, or evolutions. They are not anything that implies a correspondence among relations. Becomings involve a movement in which the real is the becoming and not the supposedly fixed terms through which that becoming passes. And that they are not, she makes very clear, they are not fantasies. They are very real. This idea of becoming is something, even in Deleuze and Guattari, that has has embodied implications for sure. In Deleuze and Guattari, as Ahmed notes, they use the language of fascination to discuss becoming. So moving from one zone to the next, so engaging these kind of zones of proximity, one must have some degree of fascination or some recognition of an outside or a space in which they currently don't reside, and see the possibility to move to that space, which would then imply any other number of movements, a sort of fractalization in that very process. But what she states, or what she asks, is that what fascinates is the multiplicity that cannot be simply grasped or placed inside or outside. Fantasy names this fascination. It names this fascination with an otherness which cannot simply be relegated to the outside. So we see where she might be going with this, where it has this otherness, or this sort of outside, is painted with this sort of liberatory, emancipatory brush. It is given that identity from which the inside group can then lay claim to it, a sort of appropriation or philosophical appropriation. We come across two questions then that Ahmed poses in relation to this. First, to what extent do the narratives of becoming discussed in By a Thousand Plateaus involve a fascination with otherness in a way which reinscribes an identity through becoming? And secondly, to what extent do the accounts of these narratives of becoming themselves install particular fantasies of otherness, the motivated nature of the other entity? Oh, and sorry, there is a third. To what extent is the philosophy of becoming itself a fantasy, not in the sense of being imaginary, but in the sense of reproducing dominant social identities through its fascination with otherness? So essentially how, and to put it in what I think would be simpler terms, how is the other consolidated or solidified in their otherness? And what role does that serve in the maintenance of a certain dominant or hegemonic subject position that doesn't so much critique or challenge the onset of advanced capitalism by, mobilizing a sort of becoming narrative or something that resists the homogenizing tendency of capital or advanced capital, but actually mirrors it in some sense, where like advanced capital, like globalization, these subject positions or these subjects do not see borders, they do not see difference, rather they do see difference, they don't see limits, but see others that they can gobble up, that they can render productive for their own development or their own becoming. So the narrative around becoming woman does not stop there. In De Lising Guattari, this also comes out in other forms in the difference between the molar and the molecular, where the molar represents the large kind of meta-narrative type figures that come to stand in for other things that make language easier. So this idea of woman as being a molar entity, and then what stands opposed to that is the molecular, where you see it taking into account sort of fractalization or the multitude of different, identities that can fit within a molar sphere. And then moreover, we have the distinction between the majoritarian and minoritarian, where the majoritarian represents quite simply the in-group, which has nothing to do, we must be clear, nothing to do with numbers. You could have a majority of people that are minorities, but how there's that distinction here as well. So the act of becoming woman is just a privileging or a recognition of the molecular as being, or how the feminine has been constructed as being that space of ambiguity, of mystery, how that, by being inputted or by being forced, that identity comes to stand in for the molecular as being that multitudinous, or being the plethora of different possibilities under the guise of a sort of, or by laying claim to a sort of ambiguity or a mystery that has been an identity pushed onto women. So this molecularization demands or relies upon a sort of molarization, the molar entity of woman in itself. So woman as being a molar thing that stands in for many other things that sort of fall under its, that kind of resemble it, but within that, or that how that is a molar entity that is part and parcel of this narrative of illusion, narrative of mystery, of ambiguity, that comes to represent the molecular. So there is a playing here between the molar and the molecular, between the becoming woman and the territorialization. But they are clear, however, De Lising Guattari, that is, that becoming woman doesn't have anything to do with women in real life. So becoming woman is essentially irreducible to woman itself. It does not belong to the woman. It is not a question of the specificity of her writing. Becoming woman is instead activated in such a way that it is transformative of the social field. The absoluteness of this transformation is indicated by the use of two phallocratic writers as examples of becoming woman. So this is rather funny, though she's a very funny writer. So women are then solidified in this image of becoming, or that molecular type field, which for Ahmed has been how Western philosophy has thought about women forever. So she would be hesitant then to see a kind of, I guess, liberatory or emancipatory or progressive account to be found in Deleuze and Guattari, because this is just for her part and parcel of the same philosophical system that has continually romanticized this notion of woman in the construction of their ambiguity. So in all of this, women are rendered imperceptible. So in this rendering ambiguous woman, it is ignoring, it is erasing the real embodied experiences that women have in certain contexts, in certain parts of the globe, that is just erased by this entire narrative. Women are then forced into a position of catachresis. So catachresis being an issue in syntactical logic, or the misuse of a certain word or something like that, just a general mistake in grammar or in syntax. So from Deleuze and Guattari, then thinking about catachresis, she turns to Jacques Derrida's Spurs, Nietzsche's Styles, which is a book that it's been a while since I've read that one as well, but dealing with contemporary criticisms of Nietzsche, how Nietzsche can be reclaimed, how essentially in this context, in Ahmed's context, how Derrida thinks about feminism and feminists in relation to Nietzsche. So she says, in rather interestingly, while I agree that Derrida's text deserves a closer reading, I am concerned about the status of his accusation against feminism and feminists. While there is inevitably violence in judging any text without reading it, I must also point out here that Derrida's response to feminists, or to feminism in general, very rarely proceeds through direct citation or evidence of actual reading and engagement with feminist work. So it's really, and that's really symptomatic of the entire field of philosophy or theory. So often you can read bibliographies that include very little, if not any, women, and of those women, those that don't even engage with feminism, let alone men that engage with feminist thought, it's just considered like subpar, like bad philosophy. So how, and taking Derrida to task not simply on the content of Spurs, but on the form, and what form it necessarily takes, notably, or what content it draws upon to make its claims. So what Derrida tries to do in this project, and what Ahmed picks up on, is to decipher the inscription of the woman, rather than position her as some mythological flower which we pluck in order to dissect. In this sense, the woman that inhabits the text of Spurs does not properly belong to either the proper names of Nietzsche or Derrida, but occupies the intertextual, potentially endless, space between them, as the interval of their very textual relation. She cannot be attributed to either, insofar as either name functions as an indicator for an exhaustible conceptual and semiological space. So it's how even the attempt by Derrida to challenge at least the way in which a woman is constructed in A Thousand Plateaus, or that way to construct women, is in itself a construction of women, precisely by the lack of scholarly engagement with women, and that having the white man tell women what they are, what they can be, but simply at the level of the discourse as being that still within Derrida, or within himself and Nietzsche. So still in this move, we can see the remnants of this sort of thinking, where Ahmed says that this is represented as the beginning of history and narrative, and also the beginning of woman. Quoting Derrida, "Distance, woman, averts truth, the philosopher," to which Ahmed continues, "But why is the beginning of history and narrative already defined as woman? Why is history already gendered in this way? The asking of such questions introduces the context surrounding philosophy itself, the power relations that involve the definition and demarcation of who or what is the subject and object of a discursive and philosophical exchange." So women still retain that degree of signification here that men stand outside of, and that men like Derrida or like Nietzsche are able to iterate, are able to enunciate this idea of woman. Now all this comes down to, in rendering the woman still an image, is the effacing of women's experiences in the real world, of women's voices. So although this is an attempt, or it could be read as an attempt to speak to the Western philosophical tradition of constructing women in a certain way. Derrida does the exact same thing, at least according to Ahmed, in constructing woman as a certain thing, solidifying her in her image. So then she moves into her next section here, feminism and woman, and how those two things are reconciled, where she starts out by saying, in the previous two sections, I have provided careful and close readings of 1,000 plateaus and spurs in order to demonstrate the difficulties sustained by narratives which assume the figure of woman. So Ahmed's critique of these forms of postmodern challenge are for her not a call to return to a basic biological essentialism. It demands actually another turn. And this is a turn that she says that is a return to why feminists themselves have engaged in a substantive critique of both essentialism and referentiality in theorizing women. The strongest critique has come from black feminism and the recognition that what is meant by woman as such usually refers to white woman. So when we think of becoming woman, when we think of woman via Derrida, what woman is that? As I posed this question a little earlier, it is most often this idea of the white, thin, able-bodied, suburban, straight-haired woman that comes to stand in for all these other things. So Ahmed, to emphasize his point, quotes Audre Lorde when she states that as white women ignore built-in privilege of whiteness and define woman in terms of their own experience alone, then women of color become other, the outsider whose experience and tradition is too alien to comprehend. So it's, in a sense, those women come to stand as the minoritarian type figure or as the molecular type figure in relation to white women who are able to bathe in a certain privilege and a certain comfort relative to that of the white man. So we are caught, however, because we need to, in her words, qualify our arguments by a recognition that essentialism is not a conceptual horizon that can be simply transcended. So it is not as though certain women have certain attributes based on their race or their gender or their sex, but rather are things that, essentialism is a thing that must be transcended, we must move beyond that. So she says that she would add here that essentialism is itself impossible as such. Any positing of pure essence always requires contingent and non-essential details, and so is always already contaminated by its other. So postmodernism and feminism do share some indubitable affinity at this point, but where they depart is their construction of this thing called woman and what it necessarily looks like. So while they would both be, that is feminism and postmodernism, eager to criticize any possible essentialism, feminism takes even postmodernism to task on its construction of woman in a certain way. So in concluding this chapter, she evokes the work of Luce Irigaray, so where Irigaray suggests that there is always a connection between the body and language, where they negotiate one another. So it's not as though one of them is originary, one of them and one of them is derivative, but rather how these two negotiate and form one another. So the body is that which not only utters language, but is a very much a part of it, and how language is very much a part of the body, and how these two things oscillate back and forth. So it's on that note that Ahmed finishes this chapter by just asking us to think about the possibility of these two things meeting, where there is the essentialism argument, which is simply ridiculous, but how the postmodernist solution to that is often in itself, or does often in itself, borrow and still implement many of the same theoretical forms of oppression or hierarchical privileging that is found in the essentialism debate, which is what she's trying to consider here. And it's because we don't want to just posit that she's trying to find an in-between space, because that is a space that has often been relegated to women, and it would be ironic. But in a sense, it's thinking about how the body, or this idea of like essentialism, truth, does work in accordance with language, with the postmodern, with textuality, and how they inform and negotiate one another. But she asks us to always consider, the role of power relations, the role of context, the role of real people, real lives, real voices, and how those things can be affected by these narratives or these constructions of women in postmodernism. So it's on that note that I'll tune out here. For any of those that listen this far, thanks a lot. I hope that this has been helpful at all. This is like I said in the last episode, this is a difficult text. I have trouble with it. She's a brilliant writer. But yeah, for any of those that made it this far, if you have any problems or want to add anything or complaints, or you want to say I'm dumb, do whatever you like. But keep it cool, and for now, take